today's talk by Rebecca Bryant, sponsored by the Central Asia Working Group under the auspices of the Institute of East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley. This is an initiative that aims to bring Central Asia into focus by fostering campus-wide dialogue between faculty, visiting scholars, and graduate students working on the region. Before introducing the speaker, I just want to say that you can type in your questions by clicking the Q&A tab. I will try and get to as many of them as possible at the end of the talk. For any technical issues, please use the chat tab at the bottom of the screen. Rebecca Bryant is professor of anthropology at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She's a cultural anthropologist who studies forced migration, borders, and unrecognized states, and who has published extensively on the related themes of sovereignty, temporality, historicities, and the future. Her first two books focus on comparative research on both sides of the Cyprus Green Line. Over the last decade, she has focused more specifically on the de facto state in the island's north and other unrecognized political entities elsewhere, notably in the Caucasus. Her most recent work includes Sovereignty Suspended, Building the So-Called State, co-authored with Mette Hatay, Faking the State on Pirates, Puppets, and Other Unbecoming Subjects, currently under revision for publication, and a co-edited volume with Madeleine Reeves, The Everyday Lives of Sovereignty, published at Cornell University Press in 2021. Today, she will be talking to us about the use of infrastructural investment by states such as Turkey, China, and Russia to annex territory, consolidate power, and engage in soft power relations. Her talk will turn an ethnographic lens on Turkey's mega projects and will propose a set of analytical terms that may be extrapolated to comparative cases such as China, India, and increasingly Russia. I'm very pleased to welcome Rebecca Bryant. Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I mean, this has been a long time in the making. We were supposed to do this in person more than 2 years ago. Yeah, so I'm glad that it's able to finally happen, even if not in person, which would have been nice. This is a somewhat crowded slide, lots of words on it, but I'll ask you just to take a look at the photo at the top, which shows Turkish President Erdogan together with Nigerian president. This is from a year or so ago when Erdogan made one of his many trips to Africa. And one sec. Yeah. So, well, let me just go back for a second. I want to say first something about how I came to think about this subject that I'm going to be talking about today. And Franck mentioned that I've worked quite a lot on North Cyprus, and one of the original ways in which I came to think about it was through various infrastructural investments that Turkey was making in North Cyprus and the way that that was changing politics there. And after that, or at the same time that I began doing some research on that, I also was beginning to do research in the Caucasus, as Franck also mentioned, specifically some research in Abkhazia and in Western Georgia, where I noticed that there was incredible Turkish infrastructural investment, the Turkish construction sector was very, very busy there. And as I began to travel around and notice this incredible, Turkish construction in many places, I also started researching what the Turkish construction sector was doing and how the Turkish construction sector its activities were intersecting with Turkey's humanitarian aid and other activities of the Turkish government. But as I began to think about this, I also began to notice that this was not a phenomenon, of course, restricted to Turkey. Right? So I began to think of it in a much larger perspective. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Let me just give you a kind of structure for the talk. I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by fraternal domination, or the title from paternal to fraternal domination, and say a little bit about why I think it's interesting to look at Turkey to help understand it. And then say something about what I mean by infrastructural imperialism, and also about why I think spectacularity or bigness is so important for it. And along the way, or maybe towards the end, I want to talk a bit about some concepts that I think are helpful for thinking about infrastructure and empire. And the talk will be more or less divided in this way, but yeah, it won't be a neat division. Some of these things are going to overlap. So I mentioned that I started out thinking about this water project in North Cyprus. I didn't mention it was a water project, but I mentioned there was an enormous infrastructural investment going on in North Cyprus, and specifically in the mid-2010s, Turkey began constructing a spectacular project. It's spectacular not in the sense that it looks spectacular because you can't actually see it, but it's spectacular in its size, the fact that it was untested, to deliver fresh water from the mountains of southern Turkey to North Cyprus. And this is just a drawing of that on the left, and there's 80 kilometers of sea between, and the total is 106 kilometers of pipeline. And on the right, you can see that it's a hanging pipeline. This has had its own problems, and I won't discuss those, but I show you this just so you can see what I mean by spectacularity. So this is what's usually called a mega project, and that's those are the kinds of projects that I'm most interested in. Though I'm also interested in how those kinds of mega projects fit into a larger strategy that also includes things like humanitarian aid, diplomatic affairs, and so on. So what I see this, even this project, but many of these mega projects as a larger example of, or part of a strategy of, is something that is talked about a lot these days, which is multipolarity. And so, just to give some context, I wanted to say a little bit about that. As I'm sure you know, multipolarity really just means not having one or two centers, but many more. So in the Cold War period, there were basically two poles, and in the post-Cold War period, many people have described it as a unipolar world, meaning essentially the US and maybe Europe. But now many people are saying we're moving towards a multipolar world, or maybe we're already in a multipolar world. Certainly, powers like Russia and China would like to see us as already in a multipolar world. But when we talk about multipolarity and talk about sort of centers or poles, what are they centers of? And here, many people have started to think about this through the lens of what John Agnew back in 1998 called civilizational geopolitics. And actually he used that to describe a 19th century form of geopolitics, which the political scientist Bille has summarized in this way, saying the discourse of civilizational geopolitics is the one in which different parts of the world were categorized in people's mental maps according to the civilization to which they belonged. The civilization to which people that inhabited that region were perceived to belong. And Bille says this in an article in which she's talking about sort of the return of civilizational geopolitics into Turkish foreign policy discourse. And I would just note that, of course, today, if you were watching the news at all, you would have seen Russia's annexation of the southeastern territories in Ukraine, and the language that was being used by Putin to talk about that annexation was the language of what Agnew would call civilizational geopolitics. So, and this civilizational geopolitics has also had its ideologists, such as Alexander Dugin in Russia, or Ahmet Davutoğlu, who's the former prime minister of Turkey. But there is still a question about how, if you don't do what Russia has done and use force, right, how you're going to rebuild or reconstruct those ties after the world has been broken up into nation states and other entities. Then how do you kind of rebuild those connections, and how do you make yourself again the center of such a civilizational or such a pole within a multipolar world, right? And what I'm suggesting, or what I'm going to suggest here, is that one very important way in which that is done today is through infrastructural, soft power investments, and I think that this is a specifically important kind of soft power investment, because I think what is especially important about it is its materiality, the fact that it creates certain facts on the ground. So unlike other forms of soft power, for example, Turkey's soft power in terms of television programs and things like this, which have given Turkey quite a bit of influence in various parts of the world, especially, let's say, the Middle East, Balkans, and so on. I mean, in Arab countries, there are quite a few articles that show how Turkish television serials have given many Arab people a different understanding of, what Turks are like, who they are, and so on. But I mean, that kind of soft power is quite different from soft power that actually establishes, as I'm calling it, facts on the ground. So things that are lasting. And most people have, when you talk about foreign infrastructural investment in many countries, most people think about China. Yeah. And that's kind of understandable, because China is the biggest player in this field, right? I mean, China has a lot of infrastructural investments through its Belt and Road Initiative. There's been quite a lot written about the Belt and Road Initiative, some from anthropology as well. You can see on the left a book that Franck edited not too long, that just came out. Yeah. But I mean, of course, whereas these books are looking at it from more the perspective of let's say, the Chinese state or global politics, anthropologists are looking at it more from the perspective of how infrastructural investment is perceived by and affects the daily lives of people in the places where, for example, enormous road projects are being built and things like this. But what I find interesting is the way that this attention to China's global influence in many ways still regionalizes the problem. So there is a kind of methodological regionalism going on, maybe not nationalism, but regionalism, in that it still doesn't quite get to the larger comparative issues that are at stake. And that's why I think it's interesting to bring in the Turkish case. And just to give you an idea of what the Turkish state has been doing, between 2002 and 2022, so for the past 20 years that the current government has been in power, the Justice and Development Party, or AKP, and if I just take the example of Africa, that's just one example, but I mean, of course, it's an important one. Many people talk about China's influence in Africa today, but Turkey has also become quite influential in Africa. And for example, in the past 20 years, the number of embassies has risen from 19 to 43. Turkish Airlines flies to more places than any other airline. Turkish contractors are actually second in winning tenders in African countries after China. And Turkey is the primary aid donor to certain countries like Somalia, more recently Mali. Also, I mean, if we look outside of Africa to places like Kyrgyzstan, North Macedonia, and so on. And this has been this whole set of things. So this particular map, shows both. Well, shows embassies. It shows also the activities of TİKA, which is the Turkish Development Agency, the Turkish Marif Foundation, which is an educational foundation that became very active in more recent years for political reasons that I don't have time to go into. The Yunus Emre Institute, which is a cultural sort of branch of Turkish embassies. So there's a whole kind of set of things that's been happening where essentially the Turkish government has been very active in going into many countries that, like Somalia, for example, that no one else wants to be involved in, and providing humanitarian aid, being very active in building hospitals and schools and so on. But at the same time, gaining all sorts of contracts and tenders, making deals, and thereby promoting its construction sector, its export industry, et cetera. So, for example, and again, if you look at Africa, in Turkey's exports to the continent have tripled. I mean, of course, it's still a small player in comparison to China, but 3% is not bad in comparison to the US's 6% in terms of import shares. So, so this is just to explain why I think that it's interesting to think about Turkey as a case. Now, if we come to the title, why fraternal? Yeah. Again, going back to my original mention of civilizational geopolitics, right? Turkey, like China to a certain extent, certainly like Russia, yeah. Turkey has been investing primarily in countries that with which it has historical or sort of perceived ethnic ties. Now, of course, not all African countries have historical ties with Turkey. I mean, when I say historical ties, I mean harking back to the Ottoman Empire, which of course had control over certain parts of North Africa, the Balkans, a little bit of the Caucasus, Middle East, not Central Asia, but they're perceived to have some kind of ethnic ties. So, but Erdogan, Turkey's president, has begun to describe Turkey as an Afro-Eurasian nation, and so has essentially been broadening this civilizational definition, right? And in all of the rhetoric around Turkey's investments, the Turkish government's investments, or the various agreements that are being made and cooperation that's being facilitated and so on, it's cast in this as brotherly. And there's an explicit opposition that's being drawn between this brotherly cooperation and historical colonial paternalist form of exploitation or domination. So just an example, Erdogan at a business forum in Mozambique in 2017 remarked, "We know very well who exploited. We know what Africa went through in the past. We know very well how they exploited Africa, and we also know who exploited. The history of Africa is actually our bleeding wound. The delegation of businessmen accompanying me on this visit is the most beautiful manifestation of the interest of the Turkish private sector has in Mozambique. We are ready to share our experience with our African brothers." Now, I want you to just keep that last sentence in mind. We're ready to share our experience with our African brothers, because I'll come back to it in a minute. Now, I mentioned that today Erdogan is casting Turkey as an Afro-Eurasian country, and he's visited Africa 29 times. He was the first foreign leader after the war to visit Somalia. There was even a Year of Africa in Turkey a few years ago. So again, I'm just giving Africa as an example, but you can see that there's been a lot of attention paid to this rhetoric of brotherliness. And this is now getting to what I mean when I talk about infrastructural imperialism. Now, these two photographs up here, on the right is Central Asia's largest mosque in Kyrgyzstan, which was built by the Diyanet, the Turkish Religious Affairs Office. And on the left is a hospital that is basically called the Kyrgyz-Turkish Friendship State Hospital. Yeah. So these were both directly funded by the Turkish government. On the right, the mosque is also being run by the Turkish Religious Affairs Office. So this is a particular form of soft power relations that's really intended to create Turkey as this center of a civilization, of a particular Afro-Eurasian configuration, the leader of this Afro-Eurasian configuration, and particularly through infrastructural largesse. And I use the word largesse intentionally, as I'll come back to in a minute. And this infrastructural largesse, as I mentioned before, also creates lasting facts on the ground. It leaves imprints. Yeah. Now, I've also found it helpful, though. So infrastructural imperialism is sort of the bigger frame. Yeah, that's the way I'm describing this phenomenon. But I've also found it helpful to think about it through a few other terms. And one of them I'm calling infra-power. Okay. And I'm thinking about that as when countries like Turkey or China try to become sort of civilizational big brothers, perceived as helping and guiding their little brothers. Now, we come back to this quote here, we're ready to share our expertise with our African brothers. So the idea is sort of, we have this experience, we are, a big and experienced country, and we can, show you and help you. Yeah. So, and again, in this big brother phenomenon, there's sort of any relations of domination are disguised as fraternal or equal, and exploitation. What had in the past been colonial exploitation, let's say, of resources, is instead replaced by largesse or the idea is that we are developing with you. So we can come back to the photograph with which I began. Together, we'll build a better world, right? An example of this, sorry, I have to move something on my screen, otherwise I can't see it. Right. Oh dear. Okay. Yeah. So in 1920, during a meeting with Senegalese President Macky Sall, Erdogan said, "We see the people of Africa as our brothers with whom we share a common fate. We approach their pain not with political, strategic, and interest-based goals, but completely humanely and conscientiously." So, in other words, there's a direct comparison between the colonial past, right, and saying essentially, we are not colonial. We also were not colonized. That's another important thing that I didn't put on my slides, but I mean here, Turkey is also sort of playing on the fact that it was not colonized, and so so it's also this in a sense ahead of the game, having not been colonized, but is able to share its experience. And another term that I've found important, and this is related to infra-power, it's what I'm calling infra-imaginaries, which I see as sort of new visions of global futures and new conceptions of the global distribution of power, where essentially there are challenges to, let's say, this idea of a linear progressive modernity where the West is the peak of progress. And I put this skyline on here, the skyline in Astana in Kazakhstan, because it, as you can see, it has a slightly futuristic aesthetic to it. And this is something I'll come back to in a few minutes, but it's sort of signaling towards the future, right? It's saying something about the future, and particularly it's saying, hey, we don't have to be in New York or London to have a skyline like this. We can have a skyline like this in Kazakhstan, right? And I should say that this skyline and these buildings were almost all built by Turkish construction firms. And they also represent a particular kind of aesthetic that many Turkish construction firms have developed. Now, in just last year in Angola, on his 29th trip to Africa, Erdogan also said that as Turkey, we reject Western-centered Orientalist approaches to the African continent. So again, saying, our trajectory and our interest is different, and sort of tying Turkey historically to this other civilizational trajectory. And finally, the last term that I've been sort of working with is the idea of infra-subjectivities. And this is perhaps the most difficult one, in the sense that it requires, I think, a lot of ethnographic research, or it's the one that really, I think, can be most easily opened up to ethnographic research. What I think is important to understand is how this kind of foreign infrastructural largesse changes the political landscape and creates new kinds of political subjectivity that may not be so easily encapsulated in the language of neoliberal globalization, which still contains certain teleological assumptions about political and economic liberalization. So, in other words, I think that that we need to think more about the type of political imaginaries that are opened up through this kind of infrastructural largesse. And I think that it, in particular, it raises a number of questions. Most basically, right, as the soft power strategy, what are the effects on everyday life? And what I mean by that is, well, multiple things, but it's essentially, do people actually consider what is being brought to them, given to them, or constructed with them to be as, for example, as good as presented? This is again something I'll come back to in a minute. But I mean, another question that I mentioned before: how does it change the political landscape in recipient states? And there, what I have in mind is the way that, we go back to this photo, the way that, for instance, this sort of urban reconstruction creates a lot of people with a lot of stakes. It also creates a whole swirl of speculation around it. And so it creates new local economies, essentially. And so whatever the sort of ideological intent, there seem to be on the ground political changes that are taking place. And then how does it change perceptions and imaginations of political possibilities? So there, and this is a little bit more difficult for me to express, I suppose, but what I'm trying to get at there is the way that people's imaginations of political futures may begin to shift on the basis of the types of aid that they're getting from which countries. So there's been quite a lot of discussion in the political science literature about the ways that China, for instance, but also Turkey and other countries, are willing to give aid with no conditionality. In other words, with no demands, for example, that they conform to human rights norms. China or Turkey will shake hands with dictators with no problem. I mean, this is not to say that the U.S. and others don't shake hands with dictators when it's in their interest, but there is at least a sort of facade of playing by the rules and wanting to ask for human rights norms to be respected. But in these cases, there tends not to be. That tends to be much less important. So no conditionality, or little conditionality, or a different kind of conditionality, perhaps, that then begins to shape the political landscape by, for example, changing the local economies and how those feed into politics at the local level and so on. I mean, it's something I can talk about a bit more later. But in order to think about some of these things, I want to move to another part of my main question. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm focusing mostly on spectacular projects, on megaprojects. And in the question of infra-subjectivities in particular, I really want to think about the role of spectacle. So there's clearly the idea in such megaprojects that somehow bigger is better. And also that bigness, in a sense, propels one into a different hierarchical position in relation to other states. So you're showing your greatness to the world. It's a demonstration of your greatness, and anything smaller wouldn't be worthy of you. Yeah. But at the same time, this largesse, as I've been calling it, right? I mean, that's the term I've been choosing to use. Largesse is magnanimity, right? But it is also, in this case, about showing one's greatness. Yeah. So for a country like Turkey to give large sums of money and humanitarian aid to many countries in Africa or the Balkans or other places, is essentially to show that Turkey is able to do that. Yeah, so it's showing the sort of the greatness of Turkey. Yeah. But at the same time, okay. So it's, I mean, it is this projection of power, and you see that in things like this. I mean, there's a clear relationship between the spectacle and the attempt to project power in this. This is Turkish. This is Erdogan's relatively new presidential palace. It purportedly has 1,000 rooms. It's ridiculously large. So I mean, we can see this, this clear relationship between spectacle and power. But what I also want to suggest, in order to understand some of the phenomena of infra-power and infra-subjectivities and so on that I've been talking about, is that spectacle is also important to stage particular geopolitical futures. Okay, so, and here we start to get another strand of my work, because I've also been writing about the anthropology of the future, or how, as social scientists, we can understand the ways that collectives orient themselves to particular future horizons. And as a political anthropologist who's interested in temporalities and futures, I think it isn't just difficult to see the relationship not only between bigness and power, but also between spectacle and future making. So here I return to this skyline, because I think that it's very clear here that that there's also an aesthetic element to this, and I mentioned this before, that clearly there's a sort of gesture towards the future in this kind of architecture, and megaprojects themselves also make such a gesture. Not only the kind of not only the sort of urban megaproject, but also, sorry, that's something else, but also other megaprojects, which I'll come to in a minute. But that there's this aesthetic that points to the future, that is also an important part of what these megaprojects do. And here I'm just going to open a parenthesis, and I hope you'll forgive me for this, to say that this association between aesthetics, the future, and sort of projections of power can be traced to the beginning of what we know as futurism, the first uses of the word futurism, at the start of the 20th century. So in 1909, the Italian poet F.T. Marinetti published the Manifesto of Futurism. And from that, the artistic movement of futurism was born. And that declaration sort of praised the energy of technology, sort of hurtling us into the future. And the aesthetic that they were praising was one of violence and speed. Sort of this sleek lines of racing cars that speed us into a new and freer future, sort of running over anyone who stands in the way. And as this futurist manifesto asked, why should we look back when what we want is to break down the mysterious doors of the impossible? Now, this glorification of violence and sort of charging full speed into the future is why, as is also well known, futurism as an artistic movement was closely associated with the fascism of 20th century Italy. And here's a nice book on that. I just happen to have it on my desk. Fascist Spectacle, it's called. And fascism, has been not only in Italy but elsewhere, has been associated with the aesthetics of spectacle. So you can see it here in Italy, you can see it in Nazi Germany, for these reasons, I think it should not be surprising that what I'm calling infrastructural imperialism, in other words, new forms of power in a growingly multipolar order, has been centered on spectacularity, on spectacular megaprojects. So what I claim, and what I'm currently investigating, is that spectacular projects enable the staging of a new sort of neoliberal and neo-authoritarian power. And those may not even be the right terms to use anymore. That's something I think that still has to be questioned, opened up and investigated. But what I mean by staging is a form of gesture to the future or geopolitical future that architectural theorist Rem Koolhaas referred to as bigness, that is a type of mise en scène, let's say, a spectacle that projects an imagined future, even as everyone knows that the reality is or is likely to be quite different. So such staging is occurring in places like Astana, in Kazakhstan, or in Ashgabat, right? And this is a drawing of something not yet completed, though there's been a lot of sort of futuristic building already going on. Or some of my kind of preliminary research has looked at Batumi on the southwest coast of Georgia, where Turkish companies have entirely redesigned the old waterfront. But sort of looking at this photo, you can also understand what one anthropologist studying Astana had noted, which is that recipients of spectacular infrastructure often perceive the dazzling changes as having show but no substance. So staging then also incorporates the possibility of spectacular failures, or even the expectation that things won't go as planned, or maybe that they'll be, not substantial, but all show. So it sort of acknowledges that a lot of this spectacle is more like a stage set for an arrangement of characters than a real, or let's say realizable design for a future society. Now, a decade ago, Aiwa Ong, writing of spectacular Asian cities, remarked on what she called, and I'm quoting here, the role of architectural sublime in indexing a different kind of historical consciousness, one of a national arrival on the global stage. So what she calls hyperbuilding, come to that, she says, becomes part of an anticipation of a future that is asserted as a guarantee. And so what's sometimes called Dubaization, right? In other words, serves to project a vision of how one society should become in the future. And of course, the observation that the built environments can create imaginations of better and more modern futures is one that other anthropologists have made, like James Ferguson. But what Ong calls hyperbuilding is a relatively new phenomenon that employs architectural spectacularity, particularly in the form of futurism. But as I was noting before, and you can see that here too, I mean, these are also, again, Turkish constructions. So as I was noting before, though, it's not just sort of Dubai copy cities, but also mega projects like bridges or canals that try to project this bigger as better, but also, gesturing towards the future, a different kind of future. So what I'm starting to do some research on, and when I have my sabbatical next year, I plan to do more research on, is this is a projected canal that the Turkish government has said that it will definitely build to the west of Istanbul. And as you can see, it's the red line there. And as you can see, it would leave what we know as Istanbul today. The so-called European side of Istanbul will become an island. And it's being compared to, a new Panama Canal and things like this. But it's been the subject of a lot of protests, and particularly because it's expected that it would change the rather fragile ecosystems of the Black Sea. If you look at what's being projected for it, okay, you can see that it's not only about the mega project itself, but it's also about a whole set of it's about a new vision of the future, essentially. But no one actually knows if it's going to be built, right? It hasn't really begun, but the speculation around it has begun. So you can see that there are a lot of apartments that still have not been constructed, but that are for sale at the moment. So so what I'm trying to suggest then is that a lot of the power of these rather futuristic imaginations or gestures towards different kinds of futures is actually about the staging. It's about the projection of a promise that may be effective in creating change, particularly through speculation, even if something doesn't actually happen. So if you think about the backstage of that Batumi landscape here, built by Turkish construction companies, you can see how the futurism of it remains in the vision. So it's a type of speculative development. I'm conscious of the time, so I think I'm going to wrap up now. So what I'm trying to suggest then here in this last segment on spectacularity is essentially that that this kind of use of gestures towards the future, a different kind of future in the built environment, may be more about aspiration than reality. So such aspirations in turn are related to what's sometimes called in the international relations literature the demonstrative effect, where countries like Turkey that may be considered kind of works in progress seem closer in their historical trajectory than Western European states to many other states around the globe, making them kind of appealing models of a future of non-Western and multipolar dominance. So as one Senegalese minister remarked regarding China, beyond just money, China is seen by many Africans as a model to aspire towards. So one might then see such rising economic powers through the lens of aspiration, states that inspire through their imperfections. So unlike the father, going back to the paternalism and fraternalism, unlike the father who's always perfect, but whose expectations can never be met, the big brother is someone who could serve as a model despite, or perhaps because of, imperfections. To conclude then, the research that I'm currently undertaking looks at how we might understand the effects of foreign-funded mega projects on the ground, and particularly on the practice and imagination of politics in recipient states. And my contention is that labels like neo-authoritarian may not give us all the tools we need to understand what's happening here, and that we may need to look more carefully at the relationship between materiality and future making in creating visions of geopolitical futures. And in particular, I've been suggesting that futurism of the built environment in unlikely places uses spectacle to stage particular visions of future societies where it's precisely the presence of a backstage or the possibility of not living up to the vision that produces both speculative economies and the possibility or capacity for aspiration. So Arjuna Padarai, in his well-known essay, The Capacity to Aspire, discussed how particular groups in society have more capacity to aspire than others. And the same may be said on a more global scale as leaders of countries, like Turkey, have begun to realize and exploit. And I think we need a much larger comparative vision of this phenomenon in order to better understand how our world is being reshaped, or maybe I should say reconstructed in this particular moment. So, thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, for this really fascinating talk. I've taken so many notes. I've got so many questions. And because we don't have any questions yet in the chat, I'm gonna go ahead. So I've got a few various strands of things I want to talk about. I think I was particularly interested in this idea of the future. It's something I've thought about in the different contexts, in the context of Turkey, but I thought these alternative paths that Turkey is setting through these architectural spectacles is fascinating, because on the one hand, I think it proposes something different, as you said, an alternative to the West. But I think I wonder to what extent these spectacles are also meant for the West. So in a way, there's kind of an implicit challenge. It's not just something completely different. It's still kind of related to the main kind of model in some way, right? So it's presenting something different. And I think maybe you kind of gestured at an answer to that at the very end when you said it's because Turkey is maybe imperfect, that it can actually provide a better model. So I wonder whether you could say a little bit about this kind of a tension between presenting something different, but at the same time trying to be recognized by the West.
Yeah, I mean, that's a terrific and really complicated question, because Turkey's history over the past 100 or more years has been so entangled with its own self-perception in relationship to the West. I hate that term, but yeah, but I mean, that's the way it's put also in Turkey. So it's been so entangled with that, and in a sense, it's been so absorbed, right, by people as part of what it means to be Turkish in a way, that it seems inevitable that, of course, these kinds of gestures are mostly see the audience as, or rather, maybe the critics, let's say, or if we think of it as staging, then maybe the audience is others, but but let's say the critics are in the West, but at the same time, you might say that it's an attempt to kind of to change the standards, right? So if you think of it, I don't know, as someone doing popular music for opera critics or something. I mean, the idea might be, well, you shouldn't have the right to decide on the standards here. But it's an incredibly complicated question, and something that I feel like I need to think about a lot more. I mean, I've been thinking about it for a long time, because I think representation in Turkey is very interesting. I mean, representation in the aesthetic sense, I think the whole phenomenon of it is very interesting. And I think that there's a lot of kind of staging that goes on. I think there's been a lot of staging going on actually ever since the beginning of the Republic. I think from the very beginning of the Republic, in fact, to be honest, I started writing a book at one point called Staging Istanbul. That was a more historical book looking at the way that the remaking of Istanbul in the early Republican period was itself a kind of staging, and how that continues to go on, and where the idea was really to sort of project an image of being Western without necessarily becoming so. Yeah. So, but in this case, the staging that's going on, I think also is trying to, well, on the one hand, is taking all sorts of other models, like the Seljuk architectural models are being used all the time, and so on. But there's also this really interesting tendency, which also exists in China, to build replicas of things. Yeah, I find that really fascinating.
Yeah,
replicas. Yeah, I think are really fascinating, and really kind of difficult to understand as a phenomenon. Yeah. but yeah, so obviously I don't have a really good answer to your question, but the answer would be yes and maybe no.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's kind of a set of questions that actually I've been thinking about in the context of Russia, because I think what you said about Turkey kind of reminded me of the kind of the Soviet Union model too, trying to present, like, chart an alternative course to history, and we don't have to catch up with the West. We don't have to become capitalist. We can be different, and we can bring that to other people. So it was very kind of similarly framed in terms of we are not the same. We are doing something different, something more moral as well, something less exploitative. And it was also the same kind of fraternal language. It's, Russia was always a big brother. So it's very similar in that way. And I find it really fascinating. And I wondered to what extent people are receptive to that, because I think if you look at the former colonies of Russia, I mean, of course, now the situation is quite different with what's happened with Ukraine. But following the fall of the Soviet Union, there didn't seem to be so much antagonism towards Russia from a lot of places like Central Asia, for instance. It remained, and even Mongolia. Mongolia would say, well, Russia made a mistake, but they were trying to do something. They were less exploitative. There was this idea of that. So I'm just wondering whether it might be something similar with Turkey, kind of charting a different course. I don't know. I mean, I don't know whether these are questions or just reflections. But
no, but I mean, what you're saying is exactly one of the things that I was trying to get at, that this is not specific, right? That it's a bigger phenomenon. That the same things are happening and have been happening with Russia, with China. I mean, the same kind of language. I mean, in other words, this is what I think really needs to be looked at in order to understand what this whole multipolarity thing is about, right? And as a different kind of power, let's say, or an attempt to construct a different kind of power. But with regard to how people take this, I mean, it varies greatly depending on, in some ways, on the type of relationship that they've had with Turkey, or rather with the Ottomans, historically. So interestingly, this whole civilizational rhetoric has often been perceived better by countries that didn't have such a close association with Turkey historically, right? So of course the kind of so-called brother or kin nations, like Azerbaijan, or the Turkic countries in Central Asia, right? I mean, that's a whole different category, where, I mean, the relationship with Azerbaijan has been, I suppose, relatively close. I mean, people, in other words, where there seems to be, from everything that I've read and been able to find out, there seems to be a less, let's say, contentious reception of some of these things. But in places like Bosnia, let's say, or Egypt, right, or certain other places, it's been much more ambivalent. So, yeah, I mean, but this is still something that, I mean, this is really what I'm trying to kind of investigate, is to what extent. Okay, so I mean, what I find really interesting is how, on the one hand, there can be certain kinds of negative reactions to these sorts of interventions, but on the other hand, at the same time, because of the kinds of facts on the ground, material changes that are being produced, it can nevertheless produce certain changes, certain political changes as well. Yeah. So this is actually what I'm really interested in. I mean, when we look at soft power only through things like television programs, then you don't necessarily get to that. But because of the way that these kinds of material changes also reshape economies and produce new sorts of interest groups and so on, then it also produces on the ground political changes that can be pushed and shaped in various ways. So that's, I think, a really important thing that needs more study.
Yeah, and I think that's bringing something different actually to the conversation. It's a very interesting angle that you're pursuing with this idea of materiality. Definitely, the materiality having an effect in its own right, shaping perceptions. Just one more thing about perception. I was just wondering, because of Turkey being at least nominally Muslim, or sort of in between, is there an element of I mean, I was thinking about Islamic banking, kind of different kind of morality regarding money and loans and interests and stuff like that. I'm wondering whether there's an element of that playing out. I mean, I don't know enough about Turkey to know whether that would be an important part of the Turkish way of doing things. But is there an element to that, and how would it help people respond better to investments in their country, coming from Turkey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there does seem to be that does seem to play a factor in, let's say, Muslim African countries, as far as I can see. I mean, it is the case that the current Turkish government and Erdogan in particular have been really against interest rates. For example, I mean, that's what's tanking the economy right now. Their refusal to raise interest rates, and I don't really understand it myself, but but that's what everyone says that it has to do with it. Their opposition to interest, and though I don't know, they've managed to fiddle with things in some way that the economy hasn't completely collapsed. But yeah, that idea of Turkey, but this particular government in Turkey, as a sort of moral actor, does seem to play a role. But again, it's so difficult to disentangle the rhetoric from how it plays out on the ground. I mean, I can only kind of, for many cases, I can only rely on, other reports of it. But the interesting thing, as I say, is that for the case of Turkey, this really hasn't been studied. I mean, that's what I find very interesting. So China has been studied so much, but a case like Turkey really hasn't. And there are other cases like India, for example. Less so, but still, I mean, this isn't the only instance of the phenomenon,
and of course, because these countries would have they'd be recipients of aid from or infrastructural projects from different places, so there might be Chinese, there'd be Chinese and Turkish and other and Western involvement in the same country. Exactly. So then it's going to become comparative as well. People can say, "Oh, these people seem to be doing better than the other ones." So, but I've got like billions more questions, but I can email you. I just read a question that we received. Thanks for this fascinating talk. I was wondering how you would position the infrastructural pasts of these places in relation to architectural futurism and its spectacular largesse. More specifically, I'm considering overly present high modernist urban scapes in post-Soviet recipients.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Franck, maybe you would also be able to say something about this. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that actually I want someone like you to work with, to try to work out, because I think it is really interesting to try to disentangle how these different materialities, these different kind of architectural or infrastructural visions, right, and the kinds of futures that they project, even if they're futures coming from the past, right? How they then influence the ways that people think about their present. So if we think about it just within the framework of everyday geopolitics, right, then you could say, well, certain kinds of aesthetics evoke or gesture towards particular kinds of future visions, and we can situate ourselves, let's say, temporally within that. But what does it mean when you are in Batumi, let's say, and you're walking past this Turkish constructed, skyscraper in the shape of like a giant glass egg, and on the other side is a crumbling Soviet apartment block. So, they're both of these at the time that they were built were projecting particular kinds of futures, and then how do those connect now? I think, that's a really fascinating question, So I should say, for those people who don't know, Franck, you already know it. Actually, Görkem, who asked the question, she already knows as well. I have this grant application that's still pending to do research on this subject at a larger scale. And one of the things that I propose to do in that project is actually precisely this. To bring in people who have worked on Soviet infrastructural investment in the same areas where, let's say, there's a lot of Turkish infrastructural investment right now. People who are have already been working on Chinese infrastructural investment in such areas, and look at how these different understandings of the role of the material landscape connect or clash, in people's imaginaries. So we'll see if that happens.
That definitely taps into another interest of mine. Is for me, was the way futures were imagined in the Soviet times, and how they were always imagined as something were going to become. There was always this waiting for something to become, and then it crumbled before it became. So so you have this kind of parallel, incompleted, trajectories of futures that become future past, and kind of mixed up with melancholy, and I find it really fascinating. And it kind of also resonate with certain architectural projects in China. We have these gigantic things that are created that sort of crumble very quickly, and they haven't really had the time to really come into their own yet, and they already crumble. And I think this kind of mixture of past and future is fascinating. So I think comparing so I let me see, because I had other questions. I think I sort of it sort of also reminded me. Because I when you were talking about Turkey, I was thinking of Mongolia, where I did my ethnographic research for my Ph.D, and I was thinking of South Korea, sort of became a source of aid and bringing projects on this. And before it was just Russia, and then sort of China, and then to have an external actor, and how that sort of played into it. The way they were seen also as less exploitative, because it was not a country they were kind of wedged against. It was, further away. So there was also this element of the TV soft power that you mentioned. It's very, very big in Mongolia. So I was thinking it would be kind of interesting to see to what extent the place of South Korea in parts of the world as kind of echo maybe the place of Turkey in the Middle East. I don't know whether there's much work has been done on that, but that would be kind of interesting. Because your project is going to be comparative, and you're going to have to read so much about so many countries.
It's true. I have to read all the stuff. It's interesting. Actually, there's been quite a bit of comparison of Turkey and Japan, but I don't think of South Korea. Having more to do with their trajectories of modernization and things like that.
And also I think Korea is also kind of wanting to position itself as well, like Turkey, like away from Japan and away from China, kind of, and its own. Yeah, and I don't know. I think there's some kind of interesting parallel between the two.
Yeah.
We have another question coming in. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I just wanted to know your assessment about China's build of brotherhood in those regions where China doesn't have any historical linkages. China now uses lots of similar language you mentioned here that aim to create fraternal linkages as well. To what extent is it successful or not compared to other foreign actors? Yeah, that's a very interesting question.
Yeah, that is an interesting question, but unfortunately, I don't have a good answer to it because, I mean, I don't work on China. Yeah, so I mean, I've done a lot of reading, but I don't feel that I can say for sure. Maybe Franck, you.
Well, I think you could answer because I mean, you cannot say anything about China, but you could maybe see how it resonates in Turkey, because I think that's the point here. It doesn't always resonate when China uses that term with countries it doesn't have any historical connection to. So how does it work with Turkey? How do people respond to this idea of being kind of taken in, into the Turkish family? Because I know just from Central Asia, I know that there's some resistance from Central Asians to be also seen as kind of the little brother of Turkey, and not being their own entity and just being kind of subordinate. So I wonder about countries that do not have this connection with Turkey, whether they'd be happy to be brothers. I guess that's the question kind of inside.
Well, so I mean, generally speaking, the way that this rhetoric has mostly worked has been, again, to refer to people who have those historical ties, or, for example, in Africa. In the parts of Africa that were not historically connected to, Ottoman rule, it's mostly been Muslim countries, not entirely, but mostly. I mean, the exception would be, for example, Ethiopia. But there are, even though it was not part of the Ottoman Empire, there were these historical connections. Yeah, so there's still actually Turkey has also been the Turkish government has also been going around and finding all sorts of Ottoman outposts or different monuments and so on that they've been trying to restore. So they've been trying to find different kinds of connections.
So not unlike China.
Yeah. So I think that, I'm trying to think if there are any examples, but really I don't think that for the most part this kind of investment has been. Say for the most part, I don't think that this kind of investment has taken place in countries where there's not also some kind of sort of underpinning for that rhetoric.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I mean, where it doesn't exist, there's a different approach. So for example, there's an approach more through people, like diaspora.
Okay.
So in Europe, for example, the approach is in that direction, but it's not part of its sort of civilizational base, let's say.
Right.
Yeah. But I think so. China. I'm just looking at the question. China uses a lot of similar languages. To what extent is it successful or not compared to other foreign actors? I mean, I would say one thing that I have, I would say, learned from some of my colleagues who work directly in Central Asian countries. Yeah, is that a lot of the Chinese, the Chinese investments tend to receive a lot more antagonism, and the Turkish investments tend to go a lot more. they're over. I mean, they're not mentioned as much. Let's say they're not openly kind of. They don't seem openly to create antagonism.
Uh-huh.
I would say that's not the case in, say, the Balkans.
Yeah.
In some parts of the Balkans. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I mean, and again, it depends on where you are. Like, I think that in Bosnia, it's quite divided. You have I did a small project a few years ago on sort of Turkey's soft power in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and the Middle East, and so it was one of those strange projects for an anthropologist to be involved in. But anyway, I managed to get myself involved with it, and one of the things that I noticed was that in the Balkans there was how can I put it? There was a lot more emotion over it, either pro or con.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, which also I think has to do with, I don't know, the involvement of Turkey in the war and things like that. I mean, the support and humanitarian aid and things that I mean, when I went to Bosnia for the first time, which would have been in the 90s sometime, I can't remember. No, sorry, it would have been in the 2000s, early 2000s, I guess, maybe 2004 or 5. There were Turkish flags everywhere. There was a lot of kind of pro-Turkey sentiment at that time. And then by the time I went back a couple more times, it had kind of dwindled. So, yeah, I mean, I think that it creates a lot more emotion there than in certain other places. But again, it's one of those questions that needs to be investigated more, and you can't really make an overall judgment.
Yeah, because I think it's going to change from country to country, and then also in time. Yeah, absolutely. I think
but like I said,
for China and in Africa, for instance, some places received China in a very positive way, and some didn't. Yeah, because of the history that they had, because of the way things were implemented, and other factors. Yeah.
But like I said before, I mean, I for me at least, I think what's really interesting to think about is how even when the reception may be less than positive, right? That there still may be certain changes that occur in local political landscape as a result.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It must be kind of interesting. Some countries being called brothers by Turkey, by China. It must be kind of confusing. Family rhetoric. Whose brothers are we? No, it's fascinating.
Everybody's a brother.
Yeah. No, but I think the fact that you have all these kind of actors competing for similar things in a country, it makes it really interesting. It makes it comparative. It makes the project very complex as well. Yeah, because you have all these kind of different layers. Yeah. So no, that was really. I mean, there's so much in it. That's going to be a really fascinating project for sure. Yeah.
A lot to tease out. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if I told you, but actually, I considered for my PhD before I moved on to Mongolia to look at Turkish involvement, cultural involvement in Central Asia, kind of the way it was kind of a third actor between China and Russia. That didn't happen. My advisor told me that was completely stupid, and I believed her.
You were ahead of your time.
I don't know. I think it would have been interesting. Yeah.
Definitely.
Anyway, so I think I'll probably email with more questions and some text I want to share with you as well. And it was sort of, I think we'll stop here. It's kind of also getting late for you.
Yeah.
So thank you again for this really fascinating talk, and that opened brought so many questions for me and opened so many avenues for research. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Yeah,
really appreciate it.
See you soon.
Thanks for the questions.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.